Hi, I'm Mary Madden. I'm the director of the Museum and Education Division for the Kansas State Historical Society. Welcome to our second virtual Museum After Hours program. If this is the first time you're joining us, welcome. If you joined us last month, we're glad you returned. This is a very solemn day in our history. So many lives were lost 19 years ago. In some ways, it's hard to believe it's been that long. Since then, organizations have created excellent museums and memorials in New York City, Washington, and Pennsylvania, so people will never forget. If ever there was an important role for a museum, I can think of no higher one than this. Before I introduce our speaker, I have a little housekeeping to take care of. If you have questions during the program, please use the Q&A link at the bottom of your screen. Type in your question, and at the end of the program, I will share them with Dr. Babb. We'd also like to know where you're all from. We have a chat feature at the bottom, and if you'd like to do a shout out of your town or your state or your country, we're just very curious to know who's watching us tonight. We did have 100 people sign in, which was double from last month, so yay. I would like now to introduce Dr. Geoff Babb. He's with the U.S. Army Command General Staff College in Fort Leavenworth. Dr. Babb is an associate professor of history in the college in the Department of Military History. He is a retired lieutenant colonel from the Army Special Forces, and he served in China and was a foreign officer educated in Hong Kong and Beijing. He served in Washington, D.C. at the Defense Intelligence Agency and on the Joint Staff. He also was a regional desk officer in Hawaii at U.S. Pacific Command and U.S. Army Pacific. He has written on the American military's role in China and the Korean War. Dr. Babb holds a bachelor's degree from Bowdoin College in Maine, an MPA from Clark University, a master's in East Asian languages and cultures, and a doctorate in history from the University of Kansas. Go Jayhawks. He has been a member of the Command General Staff College since 1991. Tonight, Dr. Babb will be speaking on the Great War in East Asia, for which he is extremely qualified. It is nice to have a World War I program again in this series. When we started 3 years ago in person with these Museum After Hours, it was the 100th anniversary of World War I, so we had a lot of World War I programs. I have to admit that I didn't know there was an East Asia theater in that war until now. So we're going to be learning a lot of new stuff. From 1914 to 1919, most of the world focused its attention on events in Europe. However, the First World War also brought many changes to the Asia-Pacific region. The United States hurriedly built and deployed a new large military force to France in April of 1917. In the Asia-Pacific, America maintained its military presence at sea in both China and the Philippines, in addition to joining other allied nations in operations in Russia. Dr. Babb explores the precursor events to the conflict in the Far East, as well as how the war was conducted. This conflict was a harbinger of the dramatic political and military challenges of the coming decades. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Babb.
Thank you very much. Let's share the. Okay, let me make sure I've got everything working right here. As Mary just said, what I'd like to talk about this evening is the Great War in East Asia, talk a little bit about the key players and the key events. And then at the end, talk to what it meant for the future. One of the things I don't talk about, but probably will be talked about later by somebody, is the Great War in East Asia in terms of South Asia. The Indian Army provided, I guess, over 1.5 million soldiers that fought mostly in Mesopotamia in the Middle East, but they also did serve in France. So this is a fascinating topic that I happened to run across, and I think it would be a great topic later for someone. The other interesting thing is other forces. And Vietnamese soldiers also served in France, which I guess would be expected since Vietnam was a French colony. They also, like the Chinese, which we're going to talk about later, provided labor detachments as France began to run out of manpower. Again, the numbers are relatively small, but it's interesting, and not very many people study it or know about it. While Mary says that I have some expertise in this, my expertise is China, and my expertise is World War II in the Asiatic Pacific theater. It was a lot of fun to do the research on this topic. And so there may be somebody out there that also has the expertise. So when we do the question and answer in the other period, I'm happy if there are other experts that have studied this. I'd like to start with the precursor. Arguably the most important precursor is the rise of the Japanese military. After, basically in the 1860s, there's a revolution in Japan. And after that revolution, also called the Meiji Restoration, they began to bring Western ideas into Japan. And part of those Western ideas was a modern military. The Chinese had something called the self-strengthening movement, but it never worked as well for them as the Japanese. And so when the Japanese defeated the Chinese in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95, it shocked the world. This small island nation that hardly anybody knew about had taken on the massive China and defeated it. It sort of be like Canada attacking the United States and winning. It was just unthinkable. But at the end, Japan rose as the power in Asia. In 1898, just 3 years after the end of that war, we become an Asian power. And while the war against Spain started in Cuba, the United States Navy went into action in Manila Bay and quickly defeated the Spanish Navy. The United States Army, and there's a guy from Kansas up here, Frederick Funston, who becomes very, very famous in this war. The United States Army was not prepared for this, but they put together a corps. There were 8 Army corps that were formed for the Spanish-American War. One of those corps, the 8, was begun in San Francisco. And a Kansas regiment was one of the many Western regiments that formed. So from 1898, we are in the Philippines, and we are not going to leave the Philippines from a military perspective until 1991. So we're there. Boxer Rebellion is another critical event. And what's interesting about the Boxer Rebellion is the enemies of World War I and the allies of World War I are partners against the Chinese. So at the end of the day, the Chinese, the Manchu government, the Qing government, are the enemy. The Germans and the Austrians, along with the other 6 nations, are part of the putting down of the Boxer Rebellion. Today, we would call it a non-combatant evacuation, but it was a pretty large one at the end. And this, with the United States in China, we will have our forces permanently stationed there from 1900 to 1941. And actually, we had people there in 1941 helping to build the Nationalist Army of Chiang Kai-shek, and we really don't leave till 49. So we have a long history, but it really begins here with the Boxer Rebellion. So for the United States Army, the majority of our forces and our best forces, regiments like the 9th, the 14th, and the 15th, are in the Philippines and move back and forth to China. How can Japan get so good? Well, their army was trained by the French and the Germans, but their navy was trained and helped in being equipped by the British. And so the Japanese, there's a great book on this called Kaigun, which is Japanese for Navy, that talks about the building of this Japanese Navy. And it is the pillar of their forces at this time. So you can see there's a treaty in 1902, 1905, 1911. The British see this as a balance against Germany, France, and Russia. So they keep it together. It's contentious, but that most foreign affairs are. The war that put Japan even more on the map than the war against the Chinese was when they defeated the Russians. And so the battle down here in Tsushima Straits virtually destroys the Russian Navy out in the Far East. And their land military campaigns that were fought over this port, Port Arthur. Today it's Dalian Port Arthur, a port facility at the end of the Liaodong Peninsula. And then the railway. This is the railway, the Chinese Eastern Railway is the Trans-Siberian Railway, connecting Vladivostok all the way back to Moscow. And this will also come into play later. The Japanese wanted to control this railway. And so the enmity between the Russians and the Japanese begins here, and it will continue. The United States Navy, ever aggressive as they are, and I'm sure if I have some ex-Navy folks out there, I'm sure they'll back me up. I think the Navy is the most aggressive of the American services. And from the days of John Paul Jones on, the United States is a seafaring nation. And with the primary Navy theory that still is useful today with Mahan, another American, we're a naval nation. And so as early at that 1905 kind of spurred us to say, Japan will eventually be a problem. We're in the Philippines, and here the Japanese are closer than we are. And at some point in time, we are going to end up having to fight the Japanese at sea. So Op Plan Orange, or U.S. War Plan Orange, begins being formulated in 1907. And it will continue, and it will be part of World War II. But at the end of the day, the British are allies of the Japanese, and we see them as a potential enemy. Again, adding more of the confusion as we come into that war in Europe. Korea, part essentially the war, the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95 was fought in Korea. The initial cause was Korea. And so the Japanese held on to it. And in 1910, they made it a colony. And this will continue through 1945. It has always been a bone of contention between the Chinese, because pure geography will tell you that China must have influence over Korea. And as you know, that continues until today. But the Korea problem and the China problem that will emerge from the Treaty of Versailles are important. China itself, just before World War I, has the end of 2,000 plus years of dynastic rule. The Qing dynasty, which comes from the Northeast, from Manchu, the Manchu period, that it falls. And what you have here is the last emperor, and this is the Empress Dowager Cixi. And these are the final dynastic rulers. Now, the Japanese are going to grab him, and they will make him the ruler of a puppet state called Manchukuo. But this Wuchang uprising, which turns into the Xinhai Revolt, which turns into the Chinese Revolution, is essentially a change of government by accident. And a very weak China emerges in 1911 and 12. You can notice on this map, it talks about the independence of Mongolia and the independence of Tibet. China cannot control the territories that some of which it has today. So this is all part of the background, and it's the Japanese that will covet and use this weakness in China for their own purposes. The United States Army is in China. And as you can see, as these soldiers dressed in what are World War I uniforms, 3 of our best regiments, the 9th, 14th, and 15th, and later the 31st, are stationed at one time or another in China, and they come back and forth from the Philippines. So as the United States Army begins to build to ship people to France, they leave what is arguably the most professional force and the most experienced force in the Philippines and in China. The same can be said for the Marine Corps. As most of you know, the Marine Corps and what the Marine Corps does in France in World War I, basically births the legend of the Marine Corps that will never go away. But the Marines start out in China very early on, and will continue to play a big role in China. Again, the Corps will grow. And as some of you probably know, by World War II, there will be 6 Marine divisions in Asia. You don't see much Marine fighting in Europe. The American Army picks up the amphibious role, but the Marine Corps is huge in Asia. United States Navy, ever aggressive, are patrolling the internal rivers of China. That's the Yangtze River Patrol. And you can see the dates on that from when it starts, which is basically around the time of the Second Opium War, all the way through World War I, when ships like this will leave the Yangtze and actually head for the Philippines. So there is a fleet existing in Asia that's very important for us. So now we're at the war. And as the war begins, the German territories in the Pacific immediately become targets of the Allied powers. And so what you see is depicted on this map. In China, the German Shandong Peninsula area, the port of Qingdao will be taken by the Japanese. The Marianas, which we will take later, Guam, is taken by the Japanese. The Marshalls are taken by the Japanese. The Carolines and Palau. It's kind of interesting. Palau has been in the news lately, visit by senior Americans, because we're looking at expanding the bases and runways there. It went to Japan at this time. And of course, in World War II, these will all become battlefields between us and the Japanese. This little place called Nauru will go to the Australians, and German New Guinea to the Australians, and the Bismarcks to the Australians, and German Samoa goes to New Zealand. So the Allies will immediately reach out and grab these German territories. Something similar will happen in Africa. And so the German territories and colonies in Africa, the Tanganyikas will be, and others will be taken over. So this is probably the most important outcome of World War I in the Pacific. The total changing of hands of many of these key island groups in the Pacific. I'll now cover, kind of in a year-by-year basis, the key events of the war. And to be very honest with you, they're very few. But I'll go through them. I'll go through them with you. So, 1914, it's Germany declares war on Russia, and Japan declares war on Germany. Austria-Hungary, New Zealand will seize Western Samoa on the 30th of August. So that taking of these German territories starts very quickly. And in September, the Japanese and the British will combine to attack the Germans in Qingdao. And I've got a set of slides for that. And at the Battle of Jiaozhou Bay, the first naval air raid in history will happen. And then we talked about the Japanese seizure of these islands. There's no resistance in these islands. The resistance is essentially in the German forces in China. Let's look at Qingdao. Qingdao is a very important port today. Qingdao is wonderful if you are an American Army officer serving in China, because the Germans taught the Chinese how to make beer. So when you have Qingdao beer, you're having the German recipe that the Chinese now make. So there's great beer all over China. Wine, not so much. But at the end of the day, you can see the territory here. It's mountainous, and it makes it look like this attack happens as an amphibious assault. But essentially, the British and the Japanese will attack from the land side. And the Germans just don't have enough forces to protect everything. But they do dig in. There are trenches. But at the end of the day, the Japanese, who are essentially a decade after fighting the Russians up in Manchuria and know what they're doing. And so the result is a 2-month siege. These are the two commanding generals, the Japanese general and the British general. The number of forces involved are predominantly Japanese, a smaller number of British forces. The leader of China, Yuan Shikai, offers Chinese forces for this fight and is immediately turned down. And what this means to Yuan Shikai and the Chinese governmental leadership is the Japanese are not going to give up Qingdao. And so at the end of the day, this German garrison is overwhelmed. But they don't go down without a fight. If you notice the totals, over 700 Japanese killed, over 1,000 wounded, lesser numbers of British. And if you look at the ratio of killed and wounded between the Germans, the Brits, and the Japanese, the Germans did very well. But there are, at the end, over 4,700 POWs. They will be moved to Tianjin, and they will be watched first by the Japanese and then eventually by the Chinese. But as you can see from this map, while there are some minor amphibious assaults, the primary warfare is done on the land side. And Chinese forces that were down in the area were just pushed out of the way and told to go home. The sea battle is also very interesting. At Qingdao, there were these two heavy cruisers. And I'll move this for you. The Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau. These two cruisers are in port, and the Germans can see what's happening, and they begin to sail back to Europe. They can't sail through Suez. They really don't want to sail around. So they actually head across the Pacific towards South America. And they will provide the worst British naval defeat since 1814 at the Battle of Cornell. But at the Battle of the Falklands, these two German heavy cruisers are destroyed. And the Admiral, Maximilian von Spee, of course, will lend his name to another battleship in another war. One of the most interesting things is commerce rating. For World War I, we often talk about the problem of unrestricted submarine warfare. And we everybody knows the story of the Lusitania and all of the German U-boats. But disguised cruisers, disguised merchant ships and smaller vessels that will make themselves look like merchant ships and will go out as commerce raiders. And so the German light cruiser Emden will do commerce raiding. And so if you look at what it accomplishes, 2 enemy warships, a French and a Russian, 16 cargo ships, 2 coal ships, and 5 other ships were taken and released. From August to October, the Emden did a lot of damage. And you can see from this map, she traveled throughout the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean to do this damage. One of the more interesting events of this Great War will be what Japan does to China. And at the end of the day, Okumu Shigenobu will hit Yuan Shikai with the 14 points. And there are 5 demands in these 14 points. It essentially cedes foreign affairs and military to the Japanese. So it is not accepted. The demands are reduced, but nevertheless, the post-war relationship between China and Japan is made a lot worse. And the Japanese will help in February suppress a mutiny in Singapore. And so this relationship that's been built up since 1902 with the British immediately comes in to help, and it will show itself again. 1617, you see the recruitment of Chinese labor. And I will talk about that separately. And of course, we finally joined the war. And of course, that's that great artifice that you see when you go to the World War I museum in Kansas City. As you walk through, the first half of the museum is before we're in, and then after 17 when we're in. The key naval battle between us and the Germans is another commerce raider that basically pulls into Guam and scuttles itself. But it's the only U.S. action in the Pacific against Germany. China declares war on Germany, and that's not often discussed in the history books. But China by 1917, after Yuan Shikai dies, is trying to figure out how to get the Japanese in a position to get them out of China. And so they see if they take part in the war, if they become an ally, they hope to have some ability to talk in whatever treaty follows. And of course, the major event, which has also an Asian issue, and we'll talk about the Siberian expedition, is Russia dropping out of the war and making a separate peace. And I'll talk about the Siberian expedition at the end. So by December, the United States is in the war, China's in the war, but the Russians are out of the war. What does China look like while this is going on? This wonderful map from the West Point Atlas points to the confusion in China. All of these pink areas are different warlords. And they are every kind of warlord imaginable. There are Christian warlords, there are Buddhist warlords, there's Muslim warlords, there's drug dealing warlords. But down here in the blue, this is the home of Sun Yat-sen and his military advisor, Chiang Kai-shek. But at this time, this is a very weak organization. But China is split. This gentleman here is, for all intents and purposes, the head of this fractured China during the period. But he is spending most of his time trying to come to grips with the fractured nation of China. So what did the Chinese contribute to the war? A labor corps. So the British and the French, who are both running out of manpower, actually find in China not coolie labor, but some of the better young men, they're checked for their health, they're checked for their education and schooling, and they will end up heading for China. Now, the Chinese going to Europe basically sail to Canada, take trains across Canada, and then cross the Atlantic. One of those transports is sunk, and over 500 Chinese are lost. The Chinese will not return until between 1918 and 1920. And those who served in Russia are another interesting bunch. Chiang Kai-shek and, Sun Yat-sen will develop a relationship with Russia. And there's a Sun Yat-sen University that will be formed in Russia. And he will send Chiang Kai-shek to Russia to learn from the communists. So what you get is communism in China springing from a European version from France and another European version that will come out of Russia. But this picture here is one of the gravestones. The Chinese did not fight, but they were forward enough to dig trenches, and as you can see from this picture here, to do the maintenance just behind the lines. So they were an important addition. The other very interesting piece is how good the Japanese Navy is. They were good enough to defeat the Russians at the Battle of Tsushima Straits in the Russo-Japanese War. But by the First World War, they have got an excellent navy. And the Brits, having to man the Atlantic and do the convoy escort, turn over the Mediterranean to the Japanese. So the cruiser Akashi and 17 destroyers are doing the convoy escort and anti-submarine patrols in the Mediterranean for the Brits, or for the Allies. And in 1919, one of the cruisers is replaced by another cruiser. And you see in the reports how highly the Japanese were praised for the job that they did in the Mediterranean. Now, we're going to find out that the Japanese Navy is a pretty solid organization later on. But it's this building of an experience base in the Navy that matters. That gets us to the Treaty of Versailles. And you don't see any Asians in here. At the end of the day, the treaty in Europe is the treaty in Europe. And the Japanese are able to get something out of it, which is they get to retain their territories in Korea and China. There is a Chinese delegate here, Winston Chu, and they attempt to get the Shandong Peninsula and Qingdao back. And the European powers basically say, nope, that's a problem between you and the Japanese. We're not going to deal with it. And so they don't. What does that bring on? Well, the foundation of the growth of communism in China. And so you get what's called the May 4th movement. And I have a whole separate briefing on the rise of communism in China that I'll be doing at the World War I Museum in October, virtual. So that will be available for folks to look at. But we also see in March of 1919, a big movement in Korea. And if those soldiers or sailors, airmen out there that have served in Korea know, March is the time for student protests against the government. Well, it didn't start yesterday. It didn't start in the 60s and 70s. It goes back to 1919, and the whole idea that both Korea and China hoped to get out of the Treaty of Versailles independence and rid themselves of the Japanese. And the European powers would have none of it. I mentioned the Siberian expedition. It starts while the war is going on. Initially, it begins by sending U.S. forces from these different nations that are listed on here to Vladivostok. And here's the famous rail lines. And so at the end of the day, what happens is there's a Czech legion, 30,000 soldiers, some with families, that are allies, and they are moving from Western Russia to escape the revolution. And after that Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And so President Wilson sends about 5,000 Americans under Major General Graves to guard the rail line and to help the Czech forces escape. The problem is the French, the Brits, and the Japanese have a different idea. The Japanese idea is to control this rail line. The British and French idea is to get this Czech legion into Vladivostok, get them on ships, and get them back to fight on the front in Europe again. And for the United States, we're kind of stuck in the middle. And the guidance that Wilson gives General Graves is basically play no role. And this is all happening as the Russian Revolution. The White Russians and the Red Russians are trying to control this territory. they will eventually win. And by 22, American forces are gone, and the Japanese will basically move back to Chinese Manchuria and Korea. So the seeds of future war in Europe are also sown in the Far East during these years. And so Japanese expansion will lead inexorably to war in Asia. It starts in China in 1937. World War II doesn't begin in 1939 in Poland. It begins in Beijing in 1937. And by 1941, the Japanese have placed themselves in this outer barrier of islands that they captured during World War I. Some excellent sources, if you're looking for something to read. Betrayed Allies is a great story. It's the story of China and the Great War. This book here on the Japanese in the Great War is mostly about the politics within Japan, but from that you can ferret out. And then Sarah Payne, SCM Payne, is a professor up at the Navy War College in Rhode Island. This is a great book. If you're not very familiar with the wars in Asia, she does a great job talking from 1911 to 1949. Brian McAllister Lynn, who I think is still down at Texas A&M, the U.S. Army in the Pacific, 1902. It's also a wonderful book. And this book by Paul Dunscombe on the Siberian expedition. Paul Dunscombe and I were classmates at KU. We got our PhDs together in history at KU. And this was Paul's dissertation, and it is an excellent book and fills the hole. I believe it's October the 6th at the World War I Museum. I'm going to do a talk like this on World War I and the birth of communism. And I will expand on what I talked about in terms of the May 4th movement and how the Treaty of Versailles basically drove political change in China. So with that, my talk is complete, and more than happy to take questions. So I'll stop sharing these, and I guess Mary will help me deal with the questions.
Well, thank you. Yeah. One question is about the book, The China Mirage. I believe it's by Bradley. Are you familiar with that one?
I'm not.
Oh, okay. Well, it deals a lot with the East India Company and how the British East India Company did so much to disrupt Chinese civilization. And I was wondering if you came across, you did address the military conflicts, but what were the social and commercial aspects of that conflict?
No, that's a great question. The Chinese today talk about the 110 years of humiliation. Mm-hmm. Those 110 years of humiliation are from 1839 to 1949, the first Opium War. Mm-hmm. So the British East India Company and the precursor to that was the Dutch East India Company, and the precursor to that was the Portuguese, that were basically probably the most horrible colonialists ever. So the Portuguese will come in first, and then they'll be followed by the Dutch, and then the Brits will come in. And so when the Brits come in and they're in India, and the port of Singapore becomes theirs, which is the key maritime choke point in Asia. And then they move to try to trade with China. And there's something called the McCartney Mission in 1792. The Brits try to get with the Qing dynasty and say, hey, look, you guys have got a lot of stuff that we want, and we really need to set up better trade.
Mhm.
And the Qing dynasty says, you know what? You haven't got anything we want. There's nothing that you guys make that we need. So there's nothing to trade. And so the Brits become the drug lords of Asia.
Mhm.
So they'll ship their manufactured goods into India. They'll get paid in opium. They'll take the opium to Hong Kong, and slowly but surely the drug problem in China spreads,
Mhm.
and the Chinese have to pay for the opium, and they pay for it with Latin American, South American silver that the Spanish are bringing through the Philippines. And so the trading system goes from very much in favor of the Chinese
Mhm.
to a real to not. And so you have what's called the carving up of the melon.
Mhm.
And that will, the crescendo of that will be the Boxer Rebellion, where about 25,000 Western troops will defeat hundreds of thousands of Boxers and a Chinese army of about 90,000. So when 25,000 Westerners basically militarily defeat 200,000 plus Chinese, it's not going well. And it, within 10 years, will lead to the end of that dynasty. So it's military, it's economic, and it's social. And so I'll step back one more. The
Well,
the Christian movement in China changes society. And Dr. Dan Bays, formerly of KU, his books on that are key. But we actually, when we bring in Western medicine, Western religion, and Western ways of government, we are absolutely taking the Chinese out of their historical culture, and they resent it to this day. Sorry, long answer.
No, it is a very tragic story, and you think about the Chiang Kai-shek and moving forward and how different it would have been if they had backed him as opposed to some of the others.
Well, yeah, Chiang Kai-shek's his own special case. He was sent to Russia, like the Russians, sent one of his sons to study in Russia, married a Russian woman, sent his other son to Germany, learned from the Germans. He didn't send one of his sons to the United States. He was no Democrat. And so the Taiwan that has emerged today is in large part a lot of the urging of the United States over time. It wasn't his natural proclivity,
Mhm.
in my opinion.
We have a couple other questions. What was the impact of the Spanish flu? Very timely question. In East Asia.
I have no idea. Great question.
We'll save that for the next session.
I'll be honest. I would really have to look that one up. I have no idea. It does not come out as a major issue in the writings of the period, but part of that is there's so much disease endemic to China and Asia that, another one, SARS 1, 2, 3, and 5. So sorry, I just don't know the answer to that.
Yeah. Well, this is a question that relates to both World War I and World War II. We know that the Japanese military was a very violent culture to their own troops. And then the stories that came out of World War II with the brutalization of prisoners and things like that. So were the Japanese as brutal in World War I as they were in World War II?
Not against the Germans.
Okay. And
so those German prisoners that went up to Tianjin were very well taken care of. So that's a very interesting question. Where does the World War II Bushido come from? You don't really see it in the Russo-Japanese War, and you don't really see it in World War One. It develops afterwards and gets virulent. And again, if you go to China and you go to Nanjing, the Nanjing Massacre Museum that's there is absolutely world class. It is. It's when you go into it, the way it's put together is amazing.
Wow.
The lights in it are red, so you have white and black and red, and of course the Japanese deny the numbers, but what the Chinese have done is they've made it into an archive, so that Chinese families can go in there, and there are boxes on a huge wall of the historical records. I highly recommend it the next time you're just wandering into Nanjing.
Very similar to the Holocaust Museum and the 9/11 Museum as well. We've had some very horrific periods in our history. And I was struck by your comments about the trade between India and South America and with the opium, and that, we think today of being a global society. Well, that didn't happen yesterday. I think your talk gives an excellent example of how we have been influencing each other for a very long time.
Now, there's a great book called Monsoon by Kaplan, and it paints that historical picture of how that trade moves across the Indian Ocean. His point in this book is the center of gravity in Asia is moving to the Indian Ocean area. And so the importance of India, and again, probably yesterday, Japanese, Indian and Chinese troops were clashing on the border. There's a reason for that. We tend to look at China in terms of Guam and Hawaii. The Asians look at China with the Belt and Road Initiative and going across the Indian Ocean into Africa and even up into Europe.
Well, I have one last question here. Did the Japanese air attack success that they had in World War I lead to the attack on Pearl Harbor?
Everything has to begin somewhere. When we teach World War, we have 2 full lessons on World War I out of 13 in our basic instruction, because so many of the technological advances that will come into play in World War II are extant in 1919. And so airplanes go from these little paper things floating around that will barely stay in the air for reconnaissance to bombers. The tank is born. Our artillery gets a lot better. So when you look at the air power and how it evolves, one would have to say it starts. And the Japanese were very quick to copy whatever the Brits did. And so, although I think the first aircraft carrier was the USS Langley, the British weren't far behind. All the Dreadnought, the battleship, was the biggie. We start to see the development of carriers very quickly, and the Japanese quickly adopted it.
Well, thank you. That was very insightful. And I do have to say, one of the benefits of having this done virtually as opposed to being in our classroom is you can actually see the slides. In our classroom, we don't have the best setup. And if you're in the cheap seats in the back, sometimes you can't always read the maps. So this was very helpful because you had a very complex story that you told very well. And the images and the maps were wonderful, and the timelines. So I certainly enjoyed tonight's presentation. I hope all of you watching enjoyed it as well, and that you'll join us next month. Our program next month is October 6th, or excuse me, October 9th. It's a Friday. And please tell your friends. And of course, donations are always welcome to help with our programs. The speakers next month are Diane Eichhoff and Erin Barnhart, and they will present on a very timely topic, the long road to women's suffrage in Kansas. I hope the Kansas Museum of History, I hope will be open by then. If not, we are going to be uploading a virtual tour of that exhibit. Watch for it in the next couple weeks on our website. I think one of the things you're going to be very surprised to learn about our exhibit and also the program next month is how Kansas played such a crucial role in the fight for suffrage on a national level and how many firsts happened here. So I want to thank Dr. Babb again for just a very insightful program and for one that just opened up all kinds of questions and also gave me all kinds of answers. So I think I can hear virtual clapping around the world in our audience. So from all of us at Museum After Hours, I want to thank you for joining us and good night.